Hi guys, I'm Jordan. We're so excited to worship with you this morning. Let's put our hands together. Jesus, you are the light in our darkest hour, lifting our eyes to the hope of salvation. Every day, every day, every day. Because you are who you say you are, and we can go where you go. Because you are who you say you are. If you're troubled and heavy-hearted, come to Jesus and find your peace. And if you're run down and empty-handed, come to Jesus and find your strength. As He is hope for the hopeless, rest for the weary, help for the hurting. He is mending the broken, bearing the burdens, all that you're needing. He is. And if you're wandering in the darkness, come to Jesus and find your way. If you want freedom and need forgiveness, just come to Jesus and find His grace. He is hope for the hopeless, rest for the weary, help for the hurting. He is mending the broken, bearing the burdens, all that you're needing. He is Comforter, Counselor, Prince of Peace, Author and Maker of everything, Defender, Deliverer, King of Kings. He is Helper and Healer forevermore, Savior and Shelter through every storm, my refuge, Redeemer and Lord of Lords. He is Child of Heaven and Son of Man, Provider, Protector, the great I am, Alpha, Omega, beginning and end. He is hope for the hopeless, rest for the weary, help for the hurting. He is mending the broken, bearing the burden, all that you're needing. He is all that you're needing. This morning, let's surrender our burdens to Him and our heavy hearts, and trust that He is faithful and that He will see us through our adversities, and see us through these trials that we may be going through. And He will lift our heavy hearts even when it seems like there is no way out of the situation that we're in. Walking around these walls, I thought by now they'd fall, but you have never failed me. Waiting for change to come, knowing the battle's won, for you have never
promise still stands. Great is your faithfulness, your faithfulness. I'm still in your hands. This is my confidence. You've never failed me yet.
Well, there's only two groups of people here today. Those of you that would love to go to Chicago and do tilt, and those of you who wouldn't. How many of you are ready for the tilt? How many of you are going to stay right home? Thank you very much. Some of you that are here with somebody else, a partner, one of you is going and the other one's staying home. All the bases are covered right there. Well, Ann and I got to be in Chicago a few days ago, and we went on tilt, and I learned something about myself. I could simultaneously experience exhilaration and thrill and sheer terror and anguish all at the same time. I also discovered that I can trust people that I've never met and never will meet, a whole lot of them. Some dreamer that thought of this scheme, an architect that put it together, the designers that did the engineering work, and the general contractor that got the people together to build it, and the plexiglass maker, and the hydraulics folks, and the workers that put it together, and the maintenance people, and the people that insure it, and the people that push the tilt button. I trust a lot of people that I've never met. And I want to talk with you today about trust. We're using the word generosity, and I hesitate to use it because you think I'm talking about money. But today we're really talking about a heart that is designed in a way that trusts in an uncertain time in ways that you haven't trusted before. And I have a hunch that this is timely for us because if you're like me, I'm having a tendency in the last 18 months to trust less. I trust people less about their opinions that come out of their values. I hear stories about masks and vax and politics and protocols and stuff, and I hear these things, and my own tendency is to go inward and care about us and to go way inward and care about me and find myself an island in the middle of I will trust myself. If you find yourself at all in that story, you're going to enjoy this journey with me. If you are better than I am, and you probably are, pray for me while I'm talking to myself, okay? So here we go. You know, here at Evergreen, we have a brand new adventure. We are in this series called ACT. And we're looking at the ancient church and discovering that it is really showing us the story of Evergreen's future that we're moving into. Now, Evergreen is an old house. It's about 95 years old. It's been remodeled several times. And we are in the middle of another remodeling experience. You know, what happens in a transformational time is that you, or whatever it is, starts here, goes through an accelerated season of trend development, and you end up on the other side, and you are different than when you started. And isn't that description true of most of what is happening in our lives right now? This is an accelerated, transformational time. It's true of Evergreen the same. Now, we appreciate what Evergreen was, 95 years. None of us were here for the whole thing. And it was beautiful, and it was helpful, and it's been dynamic in our community. But Evergreen will never be that again. We're being transformed in this turbulent season. Now, some things are the same. We have the same mission to help people find and follow Jesus. A follower of Jesus, a disciple, is someone who follows Jesus, is transformed by Jesus, and is on mission with Jesus. We have the same physical plant and infrastructure here. But we also have new digital spaces. We have fresh ways of connecting. We have new relationships in this new season. We are mourning the loss of some old relationships. We now meet people and we don't recognize them the next week because they're wearing these stupid masks all the time. It feels like we are 1,000 feet above Michigan Avenue in Chicago, and we are being tilted over the edge, and it is both exhilarating and it is terrifying. There are potential losses and there are potential gains, but it is a transformational time. Those of you that are online with us today, we want to hear from you. And so while I'm talking our way through, and maybe you're with some other people as well and having conversation, make sure that you are interacting with us. We'd love to hear from you. We want you to post. We want you to chat. We want to hear what's going on for you. We want you to engage, and we want you to share your experiences with us right now. And then we're going to receive communion together. So if you're online, make sure that you get some bread and your beverage ready for the end of this talk when we're going to receive communion. If you're here in the room and you don't have the communion elements, go ahead and lift your hand right now, and Gil will come and he'll make sure that you have that as well. So, Evergreen is transforming. We are in a fresh new season, and you are invited, and I believe you belong. So if you are, then I'm inviting you today to engage. And this talk is a pathway toward engagement in finding our place in God's fresh work. You belong here. It feels different. It feels different from me because Evergreen is different. And essentially every church across this country and probably most churches around the world are experiencing a similar kind of thing. There's some familiarity what was. There's some great losses to what will not be again. And there's the great opportunity for what lies ahead. But we are in the messy middle ground of letting go and reaching out and not certain, and that is always an uncertain feeling. I want to suggest to you that that very much is like the ancient church that we read about today in Acts. And so I started this series a couple of weeks ago, Acts Spirit-Filled, and followed last week with Act Engaged, and today I get to follow with Act Generous. Here's the story. Acts 4 starts with verse 32. Here we go. All the believers were in one heart and mind. No one claimed that any of their possessions was their own, but they shared everything they had, and with great power, the apostles continued to testify to the resurrection of the Lord Jesus. And God's grace was so powerfully at work in them all that there were no needy persons among them. For from time to time, those who owned land or houses sold them, brought the money from the sales, and put it at the apostles' feet, and it was distributed to anyone who had need. Have you ever heard someone say, I just want to get back to the New Testament church. I just want to get back to the way things were then. My job today is to convince you that you don't, but that we are. Because it was a royal mess, is what the ancient church was. And we find hope in that mess because we're in our own royal mess. And Jesus is the same. Here we go. Did you notice that the beginning phrase described their condition, this new church? It said they were all in one heart and what? One mind. Their emotions and their priorities and their thoughts and their decisions were all together. Isn't that sweet? Let me tell you the context for this one heart and one mind stuff. You remember the story. Literally tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people had come in for the Feast of Pentecost to the relatively small by our standards city of about 100,000 called Jerusalem. All of these pilgrims came. Most of them stayed in tents outside the city, and 3,000 of them responded to Jesus as the church launched. So the church is almost exclusively foreigners. They had come from other places. They had briefly left their homes, some of them families and their jobs, had come just to have the religious celebration in Jerusalem. Then they were going to go back home. But those that became followers of Jesus and were baptized stayed. Where are they staying? They are squatting on your front yard. They are having the time of their life. They don't have a job, they don't go to school, so every day they go to the temple and they listen to these powerfully preaching apostles. And then they come home and expect you to come home from work and have dinner fixed for them while they tell you what a wonderful time they had not having to go to work that day. A small handful of people, 100, 200, 300, we don't know. A small handful of Christians lived in Jerusalem and were taking care of all these foreigners, most of whom spoke different languages, had different social customs, were camping out in their front yard like homeless folks, and were just enjoying going to the temple every day and having dinner off of your dime. And in that messy environment, it says they were all of one heart and mind. Let's get real. There was a whole lot of stuff that they were not in one heart about. They didn't just love everybody else's cultural practice. They didn't love the fact that they were trying to have fellowship with people that couldn't speak the same language. They didn't love a lot of stuff that was going on. But about something they were of one heart. And they didn't agree with everything. They didn't understand everything. They didn't appreciate everybody else. But there was something that aligned them to be of one mind. And while they were in one heart, can I suggest that the previous 2 chapters tell us very clearly what that is? They were all disciples of Jesus. One heart. I will follow, I will be transformed by, and I will join the mission of Jesus. One heart, one mind. We will do this together. We will give ourselves to God. We will gather in the large group. We will connect into smaller groups, and we will be generous of one heart and mind. Now, you know how this goes, this one heart and mind. It extended into their attitude about their personal relationship, or possessions and their stuff. So at this early stage of the church, these folks would have literally starved to death without the goodwill of the minority of Jerusalemites that were followers of Jesus, that were generous to them. But the Spirit of Jesus that made all of that work miraculously, because there wasn't enough to provide, the Spirit of Jesus, we also find, was consistent through the life of the early church. In fact, you know that about 15 years later, that there was a major famine in the reign of Claudius. And the Jerusalem church, as well as that whole city and the entire surrounding Jerusalem, surrounding area of Judea, faced a terrible famine. And the same outburst of generosity that we find in Acts 4 happened among Christians now of churches far away. And so the believers at Antioch, for example, put together a relief fund for the churches of Judea. And then similarly, at the beginning of Paul's second church planting trip, he raised funds for the impoverished Christians in Judea, to which the churches of Galatia, Asia, Macedonia, and Greece gladly contributed. What we find here is that wherever the Spirit of Jesus was active in a community, there was also his spirit of generosity. And I just want to say that sounds a lot like Evergreen. That's been a part of our experience for 95 years. It's a part of our experience today. Ilsean just told us the story of the generous anonymous giver that said, I am so committed to helping women particularly who are experiencing domestic violence to find their way forward in a safe, healing, helpful, and restorative way. And I want to put up $5,000 as a matching gift for others as well. Amazing generosity. In a few weeks, you're going to be invited, as we do here at Evergreen, to care for precariously housed students. And as Ann mentioned, that some years, there's so many of those students in our area that about $40,000 is invested by you directly in providing those bags for those students who are anonymous, and most of whom we will never meet. Lori Dickerson is going to be speaking in just a few weeks on a Sunday, and she'll be telling us about the difference that you've made in the Church of Uganda by the last 12 years of financial and prayer investment, and some of you have gone on mission trips to there. We're going to be inviting next month our kids and our youth, as well as us, to buy chickens one at a time for up to 9 per family in Chicolte, Guatemala, so that those families can have more protein sources added into their diet. We are describing the spirit of generosity that we consistently see here at Evergreen. It sounds like what we do here, near, and far. And so the Jerusalem Christ followers They were also exaggeratedly generous as they pooled their assets and made available them to leaders to distribute as they had need. Now, I want you to notice before I read the rest of the story, and I won't have the text up, I just want you to read. I want you to notice that in this passage, God's miraculous power was shown in two ways. The first way was through the apostles' powerful teaching. That's a good thing, isn't it? They were able to speak about this crucified, risen Savior. They could look just down the hill and see Golgotha where he had just died, and they needed spiritual power to be able to give this convincing message that he had risen again from life. They were empowered to preach the gospel. The second place that power is demonstrated here is a surprise to most of us. It was the power for God to care miraculously for people who were in need. But it wasn't the kind of power that was demonstrated at other times in the Bible. It wasn't a prophet who said to a widow, "Your oil and your flour will never run out." It wasn't Jesus saying to his disciples, "Go catch a fish and you'll find a gold coin." It wasn't the crowd on the hill with a small lunch where the loaves and the fishes were miraculously multiplied and fed them. No, it says here that the grace of God's power was demonstrated as people gave their possessions so that no one had need. I mentioned that when you hear someone say, "I want to return to the experience of the early church," you'll want to shake your head, not necessarily. I'm all for empowered preaching. I'm not so much for the communal approach to the attitude of possessions that says we're all going to pool our resources here. And by the way, it's going to be a very unfair pooling. A few hundred of us are going to pool together, and we're going to serve a whole community of 3,000 to 5,000 people within the first few weeks of the church. In fact, that sounds a bit like socialism, doesn't it? And some would call that communism. And some would say Jesus would never do that, except that's the power of God's grace. Now, we're not describing communism or socialism. What we're describing is the generosity of community that says, I trust God, and I'm going to get in God's tilt 94 floors above Michigan Avenue, and I am going to let God lean me over, and I'm going to look down, face down at a street, and I'm going to trust that as I lean into generosity, time, talent, and treasure, that God somehow is going to do the miracle of his grace meeting every need. And so we have these two stories. Two men, same act, different motivation, very different outcome. Barnabas and Ananias. Joseph, a Levite from Cyprus, whom the apostles called Barnabas, which means son of encouragement, sold a field he owned, and he brought the money and he put it at the apostles' feet. But a man named Ananias, his wife Sapphira, conniving in this with him, they sold a piece of land, secretly kept part of the price for himself, and then brought the rest to the apostles and made an offering of it. Now Peter said, Ananias, how did Satan get to you to lie to the Holy Spirit and secretly keep back part of the price of the field? Before you sold it, it was yours, and after you sold it, the money was yours to do with as you wished. So what got into you to pull a trick like this? You didn't lie to men, but to God. And Ananias, when he heard those words, he fell down dead. Now that put the fear of God into everyone who heard of it. And the younger men went right to work and wrapped him up and carried him out and buried him. Not more than 3 hours later, his wife, knowing nothing of what had just happened, came in, and Peter said, tell me, were you given this price for your field? Oh, yes, she said. That's the price. Peter responded, what's going on here that you conspired against the spirit of our master? And then the men who buried your husband are at the door, and you're next. And no sooner were the words out of his mouth than she also fell down dead. And when the young men returned, they found her body, and they carried her out, and they buried her next to her husband. Well, by this time, the whole church, and in fact, everyone who heard these things, had a healthy respect for God. They knew God was not to be trifled with. Now, I'm not going to talk too much about that story. But have that one in your back pocket when someone says, I just want to go back and do church the way they did in the First Testament. Do you really? Yeah. What do we learn from this power dynamic that was so powerful that God empowered apostles to boldly preach the message of the gospel, that God empowered people to have the courage to generously and extravagantly give, and through that, God met everybody's need in this whole community of needy people, and also that this amazing thing happened where people that decided to lie to God end up dying somehow in the process. What's going on here? Well, we've read the scripture. Let's make some observations. Pretty dramatic story, isn't it? Of generosity and of stinginess. Barnabas, Ananias. What's the point? The way you handle the resources of life, time, talent, treasure, will cause you to flourish or shrivel, to thrive or die. We learned that one flourished and one was buried. Barnabas became a partner with Paul and went off to plant churches. And one, Ananias, was buried. So what do we learn about generosity? Well, a few years later, much of the Roman Empire was suffering an extended drought. And the church at Corinth, which Paul had started, heard about the suffering friends, and immediately the emotions sprang to life. And they wanted to be generous, and they made a commitment that they were going to do everything they could, and they were well intended in that. But as their emotion wore off, the giving dropped off. And then they were in a difficult place of having made a commitment that they weren't keeping. And so Paul, who had started the church, writes to them to encourage them to find a way to fulfill their commitment. And this is what he said. Would you mind listening? I'm not trying to order you around against your will, but by bringing the Macedonians' enthusiasm as a stimulus to your love, I'm hoping to bring out the best in you. You are familiar with the generosity of our Master, Jesus Christ. As rich as he was, he gave it all away for us. In one stroke, he became poor so that we might become rich. So, here's what I think. The best thing you can do right now is to finish what you started last year and not let those good intentions grow stale. Your heart's been in the right place all along. You've got what it takes to finish this up, so just go for it. Once the commitment is clear, you do what you can, not what you can't. The heart regulates the hands. And remember, a stingy planter gets a stingy crop. A lavish planter gets a lavish crop. And I want each of you to take plenty of time to think it over and to make up your own mind about what you will give. That will protect you against sob stories and arm twisting. God loves it when the giver delights in the giving. And God can pour on the blessings in astonishing ways so that you're all ready for anything and everything, more than just ready to do what needs to be done. This most generous God who gives seed to the farmer that becomes bread for your meals is more than extravagant with you. He gives you something so you then can give it away, which grows into full-formed lives, robust in God, wealthy in every way, so that you can be generous in every way, producing with us great praise to God. Whew, I can hardly read it. So, some of you have been very unkind to me. You know that? You don't think I have any tools. You think I am worthless to fix stuff. You know that you have been that to me. I'm going to prove you wrong, Dr. Steve Baker. I brought my tools today. So there. My garage is pretty empty, and I just emptied it completely out today. These are the tools right here. Well, pretty much. By the way, the sweet, sweet people in the 8 o'clock service, one of the dear women came up afterwards, and she said, Jared, Pastor, we don't use all of our tools anymore. Could we give you some of ours? I said, oh, dear, no, no, no. I said, I have nurtured this selective ignorance for decades. I do not want your tools. Thank you very much. If you need to get rid of them, I'll help you, but they will not come to my house. So here's my tools right here. I think what Paul is saying is that we have two approaches to how we view stuff. One is the bucket. If I have my bucket 3/4 full, I have the ability to reach into it with my ladle, or let's use a 1-cup measuring cup. And I can reach in, and it's a real sacrifice to me. And I give that cup of water away. And I have done charitable contribution. I've taken from what I have and I've given it to others. Many others have much more than I have, but I'm going to give out of what I have. What's in the bucket is static. It's a fixed amount. It isn't replenished. It's what's there. I call it stewardship. I'm going to be generous with what I have. And what Paul is appealing to from the people is he's saying, listen, I want to remind you that when you give, you've actually attached that activity with a hose to God's inexhaustible resources. And once you attach, and the attachment is not a decision, it's not a prayer, it's not a wishful thought, it's the act of giving. The act of giving your time generously. The act of giving your talents in a way to leverage in that school, or in a way for some of your coworkers. That act of generosity and giving financially as a part of the arms matching funds. That act of generosity is what attaches you to the inexhaustible source of God's grace. A handful of people, let's call it 300, is caring for the needs of almost 3,000 displaced pilgrims. And they didn't do it because they had so many extra rental homes that they could just pool the resources. But what we understand is they took what they had and they attached into God's powerful grace. That's the word, powerful grace. Listen, this is kind and generous, but it's not powerful grace. It's charitable giving. Bless us for that. The power of God comes from an act of giving that says, I cannot meet all of this need, but God can. But my participation is to be a hose of his grace to others. And I tap into his inexhaustible grace. And it says the power of God's grace was demonstrated because none of them had any need. The loaves were multiplied. The fishes were multiplied. There was a metaphorical coin of gold in a fish mouth that was caught. But in the early church, it didn't happen by a singular act, but it happened by an attitude of heart that says, I tilt into giving, trusting that I'm attaching to God's powerful grace. And that's the power of the early church. Ann and I have a phrase. It's, if you care about the goal, you'll focus on the system. Those of you that are online right now, chat a little bit about what you think of that. If you care about the goal, you'll focus on the system. So we've read scripture, made observation. Let's talk about some application. We're on our way to prayer and communion. So my guess is that most of us, our goal would be to be generous, right? And so my question would be, so what's your system for that? Now, those of you that are linear, you're going to love what I'm about to do. For those of you that are more whole-brained and by definition a better person than me, just forgive me now and hang on. Here we go. Here we go. So here's some good questions to ask. By the way, this is a list of questions that journalists ask. What, where, when, why, and how. As it relates to giving, here's the question. What do you give? Where do you give? When do you give? Why do you give? How do you give? If you care about the goal, you'll focus on the system. This is about time. It's about talent. It's about stuff. Now, Jesus said this famous verse. It's in Matthew 6. I bet you know it. Where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. If you're in the room, if you're online, if you're all by yourself with a phone taking a walk, go ahead and say it out loud with me. Can we do it together? Here we go. Where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. Now, this is very interesting. Have you ever asked yourself, I wonder where my heart is? That's a hard question to answer, isn't it? Let me give you a little tool that will help you. Go back to those questions that I just asked. And if you answer these questions, you'll be telling yourself exactly where your heart is. What do I give? Where do I give? When do I give? Why do I give? And how do I give? That's where my heart is. Well, the last 18 months, I don't know about you, the last 18 months have tested my generosity. My generosity of spirit, my generosity of being big-hearted, my generosity of not passing judgment on everybody, my generosity of how to give my time, my generosity of what kind of people that I don't especially like get to stay in my relational network, my generosity of who gets canceled or not on my social media, my generosity about am I going to listen to them again about their opposing views to mine about masks and vaccines and social separation and politics and government, and you add your own list. My generosity of trust, as some relationships seem to be moving on, and the trust to reestablish some old relationships with people that I've been distant from, or to reach out into some new relationships of getting to know people through masks, which sounds pretty awkward and difficult, to move into new groups, to go into a home or an environment of a place that I'm not familiar with. I don't know about you, but I'm feeling some fatigue about all this stuff. I don't wake up happy every morning. Little secret, don't tell anybody. I don't come to church happy every morning. Thank you. And I need for Ilsean to stand and to say, Jared, wherever you are, as your faith is this morning, be it unto you. If you want to come this morning and bring faith, you can do that. If you just need to just sit and not do anything, whatever your faith is. Jesus always said, as is your faith. I needed Ilsean's call. This morning, I took a step into faith. This morning, I took a lean into tilt. And Ilsean said, you can be generous in worship. I heard that. And so I opened myself up in a way that was beyond what I felt. I opened myself up to be generous. When you're generous, you tap into the powerful grace of God, as is your faith, be it unto you. If you find yourself in my story, sometimes I'm weary, I'm tired, I don't want to hear from them anymore. It dawned on me that it takes being a spirit-filled woman to being a generous woman. It takes being a spirit-filled man to be a generous man. So maybe this self-assessment helps. I promised to those of you whole brain people that this would only be a minute. I lied. It's going to be a couple more minutes. Here we go. You got to have another one of Jared's little charts. Now, if you're online, especially if you're on a phone, this is going to be very difficult for you to see. So I'm going to read these words, but the idea may be as important as the actual words. I just thought about myself. So this comes out of Jared's head. I'm sorry, I'm demented. It won't take long. Here we go. So over on the left-hand side, there's a series of words: personality, gifting, temperament, virtues, mentality, motivation, mindset, recognition, and conviction. And then after each of those words, I've given a spectrum. Some of the spectrum are neutral. Neither is better than the other, it just is. And some of them are better or worse. You'll follow. What I have done is I've mentally given myself a check on the spectrum from 1 to 5 where I am. And this is a description of where Jared is in terms of his generosity. So here we go. This is who I am and where I'm at. Regarding personality, some of you are spontaneous and some of you are deliberative. Have you noticed that? Ann and I, when we do pre-marriage counseling, we often give the couple an assessment called SYMBIS. And in that, there's about 25 pages, but a lot of analysis deals with sex and money. And then we tell this couple, when you have kids, come talk to us again, because we'll give you the third thing that you're going to fight about. And on the money piece, it's so interesting because often one of the partners is the spontaneous. And it's just, oh yeah, and it's quickly moved, right? And the other one is deliberative. And that word needs to be said enunciating all of those syllables. That's right. So are you spontaneous or deliberative? That's not right or wrong, better or worse. It just is. And by the way, if you are married to someone that is the opposite of you, we'll pray for you. There we go. Number 2, there's gifting. Yeah. There's people who are gifted with generosity and people who practice the discipline of generosity. Question for you. In the Roth family, who has the gift of generosity? Who practices the spiritual discipline of generosity? Am I just a gnarly, old, ungiving, uncaring? Don't answer that. Don't answer that. What does not come by gifting comes by discipline. We're all generous. Some of us find a way to get there sooner than the other. And some of us do it by gift. And Ann does it by gift. And Ann's number is always faster and larger than mine. We get there together. Mine's slower. I get there by the discipline. And then when I throw out my number, she says, I was thinking of just twice that. We've practiced this for many years. So I decided I'm going to get ahead of the game. I'm going to pick my number and double it. And then I give that to Ann. In an uncanny way, she always has double that. I do not know how this works. It's just something, it's a mystery to me. God bless you. God bless you. Number 3, temperament. This is just how you're wired. For some people, it's easy to give. Have you noticed that? And for some of us, it's very hard to give. Yeah. And how about virtues? Now, here is a better or worse. Jesus' favorite sin that he talked about was greed. And in each time that he talked about greed, when he offered a solution, he talked about the solution for greed being generosity. And Jesus opened up his heart in generosity. How about mentality? This is the part of the brain that you access in your giving. For some of you, you're emotional about that, and you just need to feel it. Man, when you hear about the possibility and the need, you just move into that. And your brain, it motivates you to give. It's an emotional response. It's a beautiful and a wonderful thing. Others of you are very intentional and logical about that process. Can I just recognize that here at Evergreen, we tend to go on the right-hand side of that. We tend to do the logic side. That's not because we dismiss the emotional side, and God bless those of you that are quickly motivated emotionally, but our interest is to make sure that all of us have the information and the time to prayerfully consider the decision that we're going to make in the generosity of time, talent, or treasure. And so we want to make room for all of us there. How about motivation? Well, on one side, there's obligation, and on one hand, there's opportunity. How about mindset? There's scarcity. That would be a bucket. And there's abundance. That would be a hose. The mindset that you have about what happens as you give and how that may or may not be replenished is a very powerful factor in our giving. How about recognition? Well, Ananias in our story apparently wanted public recognition. Barnabas apparently wasn't so concerned about that. And then finally, fear or faith as a conviction. I want to suggest to you that when it came to my checking the box, I checked both fear and faith. I remembered Tilt a few days ago. And when I was stuck on plexiglass, being tilted 1,000 feet over Michigan Avenue, I was experiencing great faith. And I was feeling some pretty significant terror. And maybe it's true for you as well. If you want to wait until you have perfect faith before you tilt, you probably have no faith at all. You have certainty. Isn't it interesting in this story how we take a step, and in that step we find God's amazing provision? So as I mentioned, as we move toward communion, generosity is about life. We're not talking just about money here. It's our allocation of our time, 24/7, our talents, our gifts and our skills, our treasure, our money and stuff. And one of the helpful things for how I organize my life is a little model that I use. This wasn't original with me. The idea of finding your 7 major life domains and organizing your life around them. Some of you forever ago read the book, 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. That's where I originally came up with this idea. But this structure has worked really well for me. I've identified these roles in life, and each year as I do thinking about goal planning and goal setting and making plans for those for the next year, I think through these life domains. And each week as I do a little life audit, I go back to these 7 life domains. Yours might be different, or they might be stated different. But the point is asking myself, how am I going to be generous with my time, talent, and treasure across these major relationships that I have? And so the first one is God. I'm going to read for those of you that are live streaming that can't see it well. The categories are God, family, friends, faith community, contribution, personal care, and financial stewardship. So I start the year by saying, how am I going to give God one-on-one time? Ann and I have decided in our family, the way it seems to work the best for us at this point as empty nesters, is God gets the first hour, that one-on-one time. As it relates to family, we have 200 extended family members that live between Eugene, Seattle, and Spokane. I'm not going to allocate my time all equally to those 200. So I've actually listed those in a year that I'm going to especially make sure I connect with, the frequency that I'm going to connect. Ann happens to get me every day, whether she wants me or not. Yeah. I have kids, I have grandkids, I have siblings, I have nieces, I have nephews. They get different kinds of time and allocation, but I'm going to touch them. I have friends. I don't naturally sustain friendships. I naturally drop friendships when I go to a new life situation. And so I want to sustain a few friendships. And so I have a short list of friends that go all the way, in one case, back to grade school, that I sustain a relationship. I want someone to be involved in my life currently that's known me for a life, essentially. I have friends that I am nurturing currently, and I have friendships that I'm initiating with the possibility of a future friendship. So I have 3 lists of friends. I have a faith community. For Ann and for me, God, Gather, Group, Give, we just go to Sundays first and then group second and put those dates into our calendar. I'm not saying you have to do it this way. By the way, I'm preaching to the choir. You're here today. But let me just say that how interesting this works out. I have a friend. By the way, most of the stories we tell are outside of Evergreen. We would not incriminate your confidence that you've shared with us. A friend, out of our community. And he had told me this spring, he said, our family is so excited to get back to church in person. And I know how many kids they have and their ages. And I got to talk to him a couple weeks later. And he said, man, we went to church and it was just so fun. We were shocked at how much our kids really re-engaged and how it felt for us. It was really different and kind of weird, masked and all that stuff. But he said, it was good to be back. And I said, so I'm thrilled about that. And what are your plans? He says, we are going to go to church every weekend that we're in town. And I thought to myself, I'll check in with you in a few months. And so 2 weeks ago, I talked to them and I said, I know that one of your commitments this summer was to re-engage in in-person services. And I said, I want to check in and just see how that went for you. And he said, the funniest thing, we haven't been in-person church June, July, August, or September. And I said, how come? And he said, because something came up every weekend. Yeah. Now, I'm not being harsh. I'm not criticizing him. I'm just recognizing how things work. If you go into your calendar and put in the bigger opposite of your commitments, then other things are subservient to that. and other considerations that come up have to move the big rock out of place to displace the commitment that's made. That's what's worked well for us. And then there's contribution. It may be your job, it may be school, it may be your neighbors, it may be where you volunteer, but it's how you make contribution to life in the greater community. And then there's the personal care about eating, moving, and sleeping, and Sabbath. And then finally, financial stewardship, where we give, we save, and we spend. When Jesus talked about where your treasure is, there's your heart also. I think he was talking about time, talent, and money. Ann and I will never have to hire an architect. Some of you maybe have. You built a home and you've had an architect. So this is all theoretical for me. Do you know why Jared and Ann will never hire an architect to design a home for us? Yeah. Because I need a home that's turnkey. Don't ask me what kind of floor covering to have and like the texture of that or the shade or the nuance of that. That's not good for me. You know that we bought a new home about 18 months ago, just before COVID. We bought the home because we told Ann's mom when she turned 90 for her birthday present, she wouldn't have to climb 3 flights of stairs. So we told our realtor, when we went home shopping for us, we need to have a new home. Well, why do you need to have a new home? Because Jared doesn't fix anything. So what do? We buy new homes and we break them down and then we sell them to people that want to fix them. Right? It's worked fabulously well. I'm old. I'm not planning to reform at all. Yeah. Thank God for those of you that like to fix things. You can buy our home once we get it broken down. There we go. Yeah. But what I've been told about architects is that they actually work with a family and they say, how would you like to live life in here? What would you like to do? What does thriving and flourishing look like for you in here? What individualizes the spaces for different people? How is it that life should happen for you? And now, what are your resources? And let's put the two together, your dreams and aspirations and your resources together. And the architect comes up with a plan and says, it seems like this might serve you well. I want to suggest to you that while I will never hire an architect to design my house, that I think each of us has the responsibility to architect our own lives. And I encourage you to think about your life as the possibility with your time, which is fixed 24/7, and with your talents, which, well, you've developed what you have by gifts and experience and skill, and your stuff, including money. To think about building your life in a way that increases the possibility that if you stepped into allocating your resources in generosity, that you just might tie into God's inexhaustible source, and that he might do miracles of multiplication, and that you as a handful of people in Jerusalem might see every need of every person of thousands met by God's powerful grace because you took the tilt step into leaning in to his provision and his heart. It was one of those churches as we moved toward communion. If you're live streaming today, go ahead and get your communion ready. If you're here in the room, you can do that as well. You can prepare the wafer on the top. It was that very church that started out with such great flourish and emotion, Corinth, that Paul also wrote to later because, they got part of this wrong. Not only had their lack of generosity out there toward others been diminished, but they turned inward toward themselves. It would be like Evergreen saying, we used to be an outward reaching, facing church. We used to love to do stuff like, the here, near, and far stuff. We're engaged in schools. We're engaged in a Renco Fest. We're engaged through Trunk or Treat. We just give and give and give to our community. But this pandemic has really changed things. I'm not so sure now about how I want to participate, right? It's easy to do, isn't it? You got to go tilt to lean into this new uncertain future. The church at Corinth, for whatever reason, says, that outside giving thing, it was a great idea, but we decided to drop that. And they began to look about their own needs. And then you know what happened as they shriveled? They shriveled all the way down to the individual person. And now when she came to communion, she didn't even care about her poor friend that didn't bring lunch to share the meal. And she just ate everything she had. And when he came to the love feast, he didn't care that his friends didn't have anything to drink, but he drank the whole flask of wine and stumbled out of church drunk. Because the principle is the generous one flourishes and the stingy one shrivels. And so it's in the context of communion that Paul writes to these folks, and he says, and then I find that you bring your divisions to worship. Now you come together, and instead of eating the Lord's Supper, you bring a lot of food from the outside and you make pigs of yourselves. So some are left out, some go home hungry, others have to be carried out, too drunk to walk. I can't believe it. Don't you have your own homes to eat and drink in? So let me go over with you again exactly what goes on with the Lord's Supper and why it is so centrally important. I received my instructions from the Master himself, and I passed them on to you. Jesus, on the night of his betrayal, took bread, and having given thanks, he broke it and said, "This is my body, broken for you. Do this in remembrance of me." And after supper, he did the same thing with the cup. "This is the cup of my blood, my new covenant with you. Each time you drink this cup, remember me." Jesus gave it all and became in a flash poor so that we could become rich. I know you, Evergreen. I know your hearts. I know your current practices. I know your generosity. I commend you today. As we receive, would you attach the hose to his abundance for you and beyond? Let's eat together. And let's drink. We receive your healing for our spirits from sin, your healing in our psyches from damage, your healing in our bodies from disease or injury, your healing in our relationships, some of which have been so stretched, even severed. Your healing in our willingness to risk as we've gotten cautious. Your healing, Lord, for some of our generosity capacities that have gotten smaller than larger. Help us, Jesus, tilt into you. And may we see around us your dramatic grace and provision. It's our prayer in Jesus' name. Would you say together with me?